The cistern water was unnervingly clear, a perfect, shimmering cylinder reflecting the collapsed skeletal remains of the transmission tower overhead. Elias had spent 3 agonizing days rationing the last quarter-liter of stale condensation collected from the rusted hull of a transport derelict, and the sight of this volume, this pristine, deep blue reservoir, triggered an immediate, reflexive rush of relief that bypassed caution entirely. He knelt, scraping away the fine gray ash that coated the crumbling concrete rim. The silence of the abandoned industrial park, broken only by his ragged breathing and the faint, high whine of cicadas baking in the relentless noon sun. He had tested this specific water source 3 months prior, finding it stagnant and brackish, choked with algae, but the recent, brief deluge had apparently flushed the system entirely, leaving behind this crystalline, yet utterly deceptive, illusion. He scooped a handful, the liquid cool against his palm, lacking the expected slickness of rot or the faint chemical tang of heavy metals that characterized every other viable source in the exclusion zone. It tasted, initially, like nothing pure, sterile, and cold, a sensation so rare it felt hallucinatory. But as he swallowed the first desperate, burning gulp, a secondary, insidious flavor developed, sharp, intensely metallic, and strangely sweet, like licking the terminal of a freshly charged copper battery. This was the taste of high energy, the ghost of ionization itself, a pervasive, electric signature his body registered instantly as fundamentally wrong, even as the primal, overriding agony of his thirst demanded a second, deeper drink, overriding all common sense. The danger was not particulate, nor was it a traditional chemical poison that could be filtered or metabolized immediately by the liver or kidneys. The water itself, the very solvent of life, $X_2X$, had been subjected to intense ionizing radiation, likely high-energy gamma rays streaming from the decaying reactor core 60 kilometers distant, carried by the prevailing winds and concentrated in the local water table. This destructive process, known as radiolysis, was now replicating its chain reaction inside his gut. As the irradiated water entered his system, the absorbed, deposited energy violently stripped electrons from the molecular structure of the water, creating a catastrophic cascade of highly reactive species, hydrated electrons, hydrogen atoms, and most critically, the hydroxyl radicals $CDOT. These radicals were the true, ephemeral agents of destruction, short-lived but ferociously reactive, acting like targeted molecular shrapnel that immediately began tearing apart the nearest complex biological structures in their path. Within minutes, the metallic sweetness curdled into a localized, deep warmth in his abdomen. Not acute pain, but a pervasive, unsettling discomfort that felt profoundly unnatural. This was the initial, silent assault on the rapidly dividing epithelial cells of his gastrointestinal tract, the body's first line of defense, and the most exquisitely sensitive tissue to acute radiation exposure. The crypt cells lining the small intestine, responsible for constant renewal and nutrient absorption, were being indiscriminately bombarded. The hydroxyl radicals, lacking any biological specificity, were attacking the delicate phospholipid membranes, disrupting cellular integrity, and far more critically, severing the double helix of the DNA within the cell nuclei. This massive, non-repairable damage signaled immediate doom for the entire cellular population. He stood up too quickly, a dizzying, sickening wave of orthostatic hypotension washing over him, followed by a sudden, intense spike of nausea that forced him to lean heavily against the rough, cold cistern wall. This immediate, visceral reaction was not psychological or heat exhaustion. It was the unequivocal start of acute radiation syndrome, RS, the prodromal phase initiated by the massive systemic wave of oxidative stress. His body's sophisticated defense mechanisms were already screaming. Repair enzymes were frantically attempting to ligate the double-strand breaks, DSBs, in the DNA, while specialized checkpoint proteins, notably the tumor suppressor P53, were initiating apoptosis-programmed cellular suicide in the cells too damaged to be salvaged. This biological triage, meant to prevent the replication of fatally mutated cells, was now causing widespread, catastrophic cellular death in the most vital, high-turnover tissues, depleting his reserves. Elias wiped his mouth, the faint, persistent tremor in his hands barely noticeable, but the deep, persistent ache behind his eyes was undeniable as strange. Electric pressure that felt entirely disconnected from the oppressive heat and his exhaustion. The radiation had not just affected the water. It was now actively disrupting the delicate electrochemical balance of his central nervous system. He desperately attributed the symptoms to dehydration and the shock of finding the water, a fatal rationalization that bought him minutes to walk, but no time to live. He took one last, shallow breath, the air tasting thin and dusty, already sensing the subtle, creeping decay of his sensory acuity and cognitive function, the first whisper of the latent period before the full systemic collapse began. He started walking north, driven by instinct, the internal clock of his biological fate already ticking down toward the irreversible gastrointestinal and bone marrow failure that lay ahead. The walk north became a desperate, stumbling march against an enemy he could not see, a corrosive force working silently within the deepest layers of his tissue. The acute nausea subsided almost completely after an hour, replaced by a deceptive, almost eerie sense of calm. This was the hallmark of the latent period, the brief, cruel intermission before the radiation damage manifested systemically. Elias interpreted the temporary relief as recovery, believing his strong constitution had fought off whatever toxins the reservoir held. He was fatally wrong. Inside him, the catastrophic cellular die-off, triggered by the initial flood of hydroxyl radicals, had merely entered a phase of exponential decay. The damage was no longer localized to the initial absorption sites. It was now widespread, systemic, and utterly irreversible. The radiation dose he had ingested was high enough to guarantee the immediate destruction of all rapidly dividing cell lines. The crypt cells of the small intestine, the progenitors that renew the villi every few days, were completely ablated. Their rapid destruction meant the absorptive surface area of his gut was rapidly eroding. Microvilli, the fine, finger-like projections critical for nutrient uptake and fluid regulation, began sloughing off into the lumen, turning the internal lining of his digestive tract into a raw, weeping wound. The integrity of the mucosal barrier was failing completely. This failure, undetectable externally, was the primary mechanism of his impending doom. It meant that the vast populations of commensal bacteria residing harmlessly in his gut primarily, Escherichia coli and Bacteroid species, would soon have an unhindered pathway into his bloodstream. The protective epithelial shield, designed to exclude billions of microorganisms, was dissolving, transforming his own digestive tract into a reservoir of systemic infection. He stopped near a ruined concrete abutment, the sun beating down with relentless intensity, feeling a sudden, profound fatigue that went beyond exhaustion. He tried to drink the last few sips of the remaining water, but the metallic taste was now overpoweringly sweet, almost cloying, and his stomach immediately convulsed, rejecting the liquid with a violent dry heave. The gut was inflamed, radiosensitive tissue reacting violently to further insult. The pervasive warmth in his abdomen had intensified, morphing into a dull, constant ache that felt like internal friction, a sensation of tissues rubbing raw against themselves. He noticed a strange, fine rash beginning to bloom across his chest and the inside of his elbow's petechia that looked like faint freckles, but were in fact microscopic hemorrhages resulting from compromised capillary walls and the initial signs that his platelet production was beginning to stall, a consequence of the simultaneous attack on his hematopoietic system. The internal bleeding was starting subtly, silently, hours before the major hemorrhages would begin. The latent period shattered 4 hours into his trek. It began with an agonizing sharp cramping that doubled him over, followed by a sudden, explosive episode of watery diarrhea. The volume was shocking, immediate, and utterly uncontrollable. This was the definitive onset of the gastrointestinal syndrome, GI syndrome, typically seen with whole-body equivalent doses exceeding 10 gray, GY. The destruction of the intestinal epithelium meant his body was rapidly losing its ability to retain any fluid or electrolytes. Each episode was a catastrophic hemorrhage of critical bodily resources: sodium, potassium, and chloride ions pouring out, leading to rapid hypovolemia and metabolic acidosis. His body was shedding its essential ionic balance, fundamentally disrupting the electrical potential necessary for nerve and muscle function. He stumbled behind a crumbling wall, his legs weak and trembling, the effort of controlling his muscles almost impossible. The diarrhea became relentless, a continuous pale discharge laced with streaks of blood, evidence of the deep mucosal erosion. He was effectively hemorrhaging plasma internally. The rapid fluid loss caused his blood pressure to plummet further, exacerbating the orthostatic dizziness and causing his peripheral vision to tunnel into a narrow, dark focus, a physiological response to catastrophic circulatory failure. His mouth was cotton dry, his tongue thick and sticky, but drinking was now futile. The water would pass straight through, accelerating the electrolyte imbalance and further irritating the denuded intestinal lining. Critically, the radiation had not confined its damage to the GI tract. Simultaneously, the hematopoietic stem cells residing in the bone marrow, the progenitors of all blood elements, were undergoing mass apoptosis. While the full impact of the hematopoietic syndrome, HS, takes days or weeks to manifest as profound anemia and thrombocytopenia, the most radiosensitive cells, the circulating lymphocytes, were already decimated. Within hours of exposure, their count had dropped precipitously, a phenomenon known as absolute lymphopenia. These crucial T cells and B cells, responsible for adaptive and innate immune surveillance, were the first casualties of the bone marrow assault. Elias's immunological defenses were collapsing even before the bacteria began their invasion. The body's capacity to fight infection, already compromised by stress and environment, was now functionally zero. This biological disarmament was the perfect setup for fatal sepsis. The metallic sweetness in his mouth returned, not from the water this time, but from the faint, coppery taste of his own blood mixing with the bile and mucus. The constant purging was stripping his body of its essential structural integrity. He could feel the cold sweat breaking out across his brow, an inappropriate thermoregulation response as his core temperature began to fluctuate wildly, a sign of severe systemic distress and the onset of septic shock driven by the impending bacterial translocation. Every muscle fiber ached with the profound depletion of potassium, leading to fasciculations and uncontrollable muscle tremors. He tried to stand, but his knees buckled, sending him sprawling onto the gritty earth. The world was spinning, the oppressive heat of the day now feeling distant and irrelevant compared to the raging internal inferno ignited by the radiation damage. The internal devastation was now driving a powerful systemic inflammatory response. As the gut barrier failed, the massive influx of lipopolysaccharide, LPS endotoxin released by the invading gram-negative bacteria triggered a massive cytokine storm. Interleukins, IL-1, IL-6, and tumor necrosis factor, TNF-alpha, flooded his circulatory system, causing widespread vasodilation and capillary leakage, further accelerating the systemic shock and edema. His skin, already dry and fissured from the heat, felt hot to the touch despite the internal chill of hypovolemia. He was burning up from the inside out, the fever spiking rapidly, a biological reaction to the bacterial invasion that his lymphocyte-depleted body could not control. Elias pushed himself up, leaning against the wall, his vision blurring in and out of focus. The relentless, agonizing cramping in his lower abdomen was now accompanied by sharp, stabbing pains in his flanks, suggesting the kidneys, struggling to cope with the severe dehydration and the circulating toxins, were beginning to shut down. He hadn't urinated in hours, a clear sign of acute renal failure, ARF, driven by the shock state and the massive hypotension. The concentration of urea and creatinine in his blood was rising rapidly, poisoning his central nervous system and initiating the final stages of toxemia. The subtle cognitive decline he had sensed earlier was now a raging delirium. He couldn't distinguish the shapes of the ruined buildings around him, seeing shimmering mirages where there were only crumbling concrete slabs. His short-term memory was failing. He could not remember why he was walking, or even where he had started. The persistent pressure behind his eyes had intensified into a throbbing headache, a sign of severe intracranial pressure and potential, though secondary, radiation-induced cerebral edema, where damaged endothelial cells allowed fluid to leak into the brain parenchyma. The high dose he had absorbed, likely in the 10 to 15 GY range based on the speed of the GI syndrome onset, was rapidly overwhelming all his systems simultaneously, initiating a multi-organ system failure cascade. He tried to speak, to call out, but only a dry, rasping sound emerged from his throat. The mucosal surfaces throughout his body, eyes, mouth, throat were drying, cracking, and bleeding faintly, mirroring the catastrophic failure of the gut lining. The taste of copper and dust was overwhelming. Every movement was an immense, painful effort, driven purely by a primal, failing instinct for survival. He was no longer walking. He was dragging a body that was structurally intact, but functionally dissolving. His peripheral circulation was shutting down as his body prioritized blood flow to the failing heart and brain, leaving his extremities cold and clammy, despite the ambient heat. Elias slumped forward, his face hitting the warm dirt, the impact barely registering through the haze of shock and toxemia. The biological clock had reached the point of no return. The continuous loss of fluids and electrolytes, combined with the septic challenge from bacterial translocation and the total collapse of his immune system, meant that even if he were discovered immediately, the damage threshold had been exceeded. The radiation had functioned as a biological weapon, initiating a cascade of self-destruction that was now unstoppable. He lay there, shivering violently in the heat, the metallic sweetness of the irradiated water having delivered its final, fatal payload, turning his living tissue into a source of systemic poison. The world narrowed to the sound of his own ragged, shallow breathing, the dust tasting like metal and decay, the final sensory input before the darkness began its slow, irreversible claim. The abrasive dirt pressed against his cheek, the sole focus of his rapidly deteriorating sensory field. The world, warped by fever and fluid imbalance, dissolved into a chaotic kaleidoscope of fragmented light and noise. He was trapped, isolated, in the chemical psychosis of uremia. The high concentration of circulating nitrogenous waste urea and creatinine was acting as a potent neurotoxin, sizzling the delicate electrochemical pathways of his non-functional brain. The accumulation of guanidino compounds intensified this chemical attack. This chemical fire burned away coherent thought, leaving only fractured images and the pressure of neurological collapse. He tried to construct a memory, a name, but the cognitive scaffolding had been dismantled, replaced by the humming static of toxemia. Shapes in the periphery, a discarded tire, a skeletal beam were morphing into monstrous chitinous forms that scraped against the ruins, their movement accompanied by a high-pitched, insistent internal whine, the sound of failing, overloaded synapses. His breath, thick and shallow, carried the acrid, sickeningly sweet odor of ammonia, a terminal sign that his body was drowning in its own waste. It was the smell of decomposition happening while he was still, technically, alive. The initial sharp stabbing pain in his flanks had shifted into a deep, heavy pressure the unbearable sensation of 2 stone weights replacing his kidneys, their millions of nephrons destroyed by shock and radiation damage. Every exhale was a desperate, futile attempt to blow off accumulating carbon dioxide, a compensatory mechanism against the severe metabolic acidosis, destroying the pH balance of his blood. This labored, deep breathing, known as Kussmaul respiration, was the body's final failing attempt to restore equilibrium. The air he took in felt heavy, useless. The absence of urination was no longer a concern. It was a final cessation of a vital function, a silent internal drowning where toxins were the water. The systemic poisoning meant every single cell was suffocating in a toxic bath, their metabolic processes grinding to a halt. The delirium was total and aggressive. He tried to lift his arm to brush away phantom insects crawling across his face, but there were no insects, only the intense, tactile sensation generated by the desperate firing of sensory neurons starved of oxygen and bombarded by circulating toxins. The phantom itch was maddening, a relentless irritation that demanded attention his failing motor system could not provide. He could feel the hyperexcitable nerves sparking under his skin, sending false signals of pain and movement. His muscles were twitching uncontrollably. Fasciculations rippled across his calves and thighs, the profound neuromuscular irritability of severe electrolyte imbalance, hyperkalemia and hyponatremia, coupled with the central nervous system's catastrophic distress. The hyperkalemia, the lethal excess of potassium, was slowing conduction through his cardiac muscle, though the brain was too far gone to register the subtle, terrifying shifts in his heart's electrical rhythm. The electrical gradient across the myocardial cells was collapsing, preparing for a lethal spasm. He could feel the fine tremors starting in his jaw, making his teeth click against the warm dirt. Inside his abdomen, the catastrophic failure of the gastrointestinal tract accelerated the septic process. The gut, stripped bare of its mucosal lining by the radiation, was a porous, weeping wound, compromised. Billions of opportunistic bacteria, primarily gram-negative flora, were translocating across the damaged intestinal wall and flooding the systemic circulation, initiating an overwhelming systemic inflammatory response. The flood of bacterial endotoxins was the signal for the body's self-destruction, triggering a cascade of cytokine release that turned the immune system into an executioner. Interleukins and TNF-alpha flooded his system, turning endothelial surfaces into sticky, inflamed targets. This overwhelming infection drove the violent, paradoxical shivering, the deep rigors that shook his frame despite the oppressive heat radiating off the cracked pavement. His body attempted a desperate, futile defense, trying to cook the pathogens out, but energy reserves were gone, and the thermoregulatory centers in the hypothalamus failed rapidly under the toxic load. The rigors were agonizing, a final violent spasm of biological resistance before the inevitable systemic collapse of temperature regulation. His heart hammered in his chest, a desperate, rapid drumbeat of compensatory tachycardia, struggling to compensate for the profound hypovolemia. With every beat, blood pressure dropped further, systemic vascular resistance collapsing as endotoxins caused widespread vasodilation and capillary leakage. The vessels, normally tight conduits, had become sieve-like, weeping plasma into the interstitial spaces, starving the circulation of volume. He knew dimly that his blood was thin, watery, failing to carry sufficient oxygen to his vital organs. The viscosity was gone. It felt like sludge being pushed through broken pipes, incapable of maintaining the necessary hydrostatic pressure. The microcirculation, the final delivery network, was now completely stagnant, starved of the pressure needed for perfusion. The fluid losses from the GI tract, the relentless diarrhea and vomiting, had resulted in a circulating volume so low that his body was running on empty, the remaining blood pooling sluggishly in the great veins. This was terminal hypovolemic and septic shock combined, and the sound of his own frantic pulse was the only remaining metronome of his fading existence. He tried to focus on the metallic tongue in his mouth. It was no longer copper and dust. It was the sharp, ferrous taste of internal bleeding, the slow hemorrhage from the ravaged capillaries and compromised vascular integrity. The gamma rays had compromised the endothelial lining of the blood vessels, leading to petechia and ecchymosis under the skin, though he was too numb to perceive them. The radiation had destroyed the bone marrow's ability to produce platelets, compounding the vascular fragility with a severe coagulopathy. This profound thrombocytopenia meant that even minor stress caused widespread, uncontrolled leakage. Every minor internal abrasion was now a source of slow, continuous blood loss. The blood leached out, not in a catastrophic gush, but in a slow, continuous seep into the tissues and his digestive tract, exacerbating the shock. This constant, imperceptible drain was the final silent thief of his remaining life force. His eyes, crusting with dried mucus, registered the light as a blinding, painful smear. The pressure behind them intensified, a relentless hydraulic force pushing against the orbits, confirming that cerebral edema was progressing, compressing vital structures in the brainstem. The swelling was pushing the brain downward, threatening herniation, though the systemic failure would precede the mechanical death. He was entering the final, irreversible phase of CNS failure, driven by extreme fluid shifts, overwhelming toxemia, and profound hypotension. Though direct radiation damage had initiated the failure, a voice, thin and reedy, whispered his name. He strained his ears, convinced he was saved, but the voice repeated itself, Elias, Elias. It was his own internal echo, a final fragment of self, trying to anchor him to consciousness. The world was now a deep humming gray, the sensory input decaying unevenly across all modalities. The agonizing pain was finally receding, replaced by a profound, heavy numbness, the final, cruel gift of shock and CNS suppression. This lack of sensation was terrifying, an empty void where agony had been, signifying the complete failure of the ascending pain pathways. This sudden, blessed absence of agony was not relief, but the definitive indicator that his nervous system was shutting down, unable to process the signals of distress any longer. He felt a profound coldness spreading rapidly from his fingers and toes, creeping inwards toward his core. Despite the violent septic shivering, his core temperature was dropping, a fatal sign of complete metabolic collapse. The hypothalamus had surrendered control. The body, unable to maintain homeostasis or even basic thermoregulation, was now reacting to gravity and decay. His metabolism had slowed to a near standstill, consuming the last glucose reserves in a futile effort to generate warmth. The irradiated water had not killed him instantly. It had meticulously disassembled the machinery of his life, one system at a time, using his own biological processes: inflammation, infection, and toxemia as the executioner. The mechanism was elegant in its cruelty, a self-perpetuating cycle of failure where renal collapse fed neurotoxicity and gut infection fueled circulatory shock, all accelerated by the initial lethal dose of energy. The final visual sensation was the dirt inches from his face, magnified and distorted, looking less like soil and more like a field of crystalline shards, reflecting the last failing light. He focused on a single dark speck of grit, trying to use it as an anchor against the rising, suffocating tide of internal darkness. But the speck blurred, dissolved entirely as the optic nerve failed to transmit coherent signals. The sound of his own ragged breath grew fainter, slowing, becoming shallower, the diaphragm struggling against the mounting buildup of lactic acid. The Cheyne-Stokes pattern had begun, long pauses followed by shallow, gasping efforts, a brainstem giving up its rhythmic command. The metallic taste remained, the last, lingering sensory signature of the poison, the taste of rust and blood. He was sinking into the gray, the cold spreading, waiting for the struggling rhythm of his heart to finally falter and cease its desperate, futile beat. The gray deepened, becoming a vast acoustic void. The internal echo of his name dissolved entirely, replaced by a high-frequency whine, the sound of failing internal auditory hair cells, or perhaps the rush of blood through profoundly constricted carotid arteries, struggling to maintain perfusion pressure against the collapsing systemic vascular resistance. His mind, still desperately trying to process the diminishing input, began constructing elaborate, impossible geometries in the darkness fractal patterns of light and shadow that had no source. This was the beginning of the neurological seizure activity, not the grand mal convulsions that had marked earlier, highly febrile stages, but focal, subtle misfires deep within the temporal lobe, driven by the profound electrolyte imbalance and the accumulation of nitrogenous waste products, urea, creatinine, and ammonia that the obliterated kidneys and failing liver could no longer clear. The electrolyte disturbance was complex, characterized by severe hyperkalemia from massive cellular lysis and paradoxical hypocalcemia, disrupting the delicate resting membrane potential of cortical neurons. The accumulating ammonia, specifically, was driving excitotoxicity through the N-methyl-deaspartate, NMDA, receptors, leading to an uncontrolled cascade of depolarization and the subsequent failure of synaptic integrity. Dendritic spines were retracting, severed from the input they could no longer utilize, transforming coherent thought into static. The blood-brain barrier, compromised by the initial radiation insult and now weakened by systemic inflammation and catastrophic hypertension, followed by profound hypotension, offered no resistance to the chemical tide flooding his sensitive neural tissue. The failure was symmetrical, affecting both the ascending sensory tracts and the descending motor pathways, creating a terrifying internal silence broken only by the chaotic electrical noise of dying neurons and the sustained, pathological firing of the deep nuclei, a final, desperate burst of energy before metabolic exhaustion. The most immediate physical sensation was the immense, crushing pressure inside his skull. The cerebral edema, fueled by the generalized capillary leak syndrome and the cytotoxic effects of the radiation on glial cells, was reaching its climax. The astrocytes, normally regulators of the microenvironment, were swollen and dysfunctional, actively contributing to the vasogenic edema. It felt as though a steel band was tightening around his parietal lobes, driving the soft tissue downward, threatening to force the cerebellar tonsils through the foramen magnum. This impending herniation, the mechanical death, was the ultimate threat, though the systemic failure would precede the mechanical death. He was entering the final irreversible phase of CNS failure, driven by extreme fluid shifts, overwhelming toxemia, and profound hypotension. Though direct radiation damage had initiated the failure, the fluid shifts were astronomical. Every vessel wall in his body was weeping plasma, creating massive interstitial edema in the lungs, manifested as non-cardiogenic pulmonary edema, and in the brain, while his intravascular volume plummeted. The systemic vascular resistance had collapsed entirely, moving the circulatory state from compensated shock to the irreversible, decompensated phase where the body's own compensatory mechanisms, including the release of catecholamines, were utterly exhausted and ineffective. The adrenal glands, likely hemorrhaged and ischemic, had failed to maintain the necessary cortisol surge, resulting in a state of relative adrenal insufficiency that accelerated the circulatory collapse. The loss of cerebral autoregulation meant that the little remaining systemic pressure was inefficiently distributed, paradoxically exacerbating the intracranial pressure as damaged arterioles dilated uncontrollably. This led to the devastating, refractory shock that no amount of intervention could reverse. His blood pressure, when last measured, had been barely palpable, a systolic reading that indicated imminent circulatory arrest, the heart muscle itself suffering from ischemic injury and the toxic effects of the systemic inflammatory cascade, including the direct cardiotoxic effects of elevated circulating cytokines, which induced widespread myocardial stunning and loss of contractile force. The chain-Stokes rhythm became increasingly erratic. The long pauses stretched into terrifying eternities, moments where the brainstem seemed to forget its fundamental imperative to breathe. When the breath finally returned, it was a shallow, agonizing gulp, insufficient to clear the rising partial pressure of carbon dioxide. The respiratory quotient had inverted, reflecting the switch to catastrophic anaerobic metabolism, flooding the system with lactic acid and pushing the pH into lethal ranges. This profound metabolic acidosis further depressed myocardial contractility and inhibited the efficacy of any remaining endogenous vasopressors. He was slipping rapidly into hypercapnic narcosis, the accumulating CO2 acting as a potent anesthetic, dulling the final edges of his awareness, a merciful blurring of the distinction between the physical world and the internal chaos. The diaphragm, heavily fatigued and deprived of adequate oxygen and glucose, began to tremor visibly, a shallow, desperate fluttering beneath the ribs, unable to generate the negative pressure necessary for effective inspiration. Concurrently, the heart rate, previously tachycardic in a desperate attempt to compensate for the plummeting stroke volume, was now slowing rapidly. It was decelerating towards terminal bradycardia, the rhythm becoming irregular, punctuated by ectopic beats. Ventricular fibrillation was the likely immediate endpoint, the electrical conduction system of the myocardium failing due to severe hypoxia, and then extreme shifts in potassium and calcium levels. The massive efflux of intracellular potassium, driven by the generalized failure of the sodium-potassium ATPase pump across billions of dying cells, guaranteed a chaotic, uncoordinated electrical death of the heart. The taste of rust intensified, not just from the internal mucosal bleeding that had painted his digestive tract, but from the massive hemolysis occurring in his systemic circulation, the irradiated red blood cells rupturing and releasing iron-laden hemoglobin into his plasma, further overwhelming the renal filtration system already ravaged by acute tubular necrosis and cortical ischemia. The chemical environment of his body was now entirely hostile to life. The uremic frost, though unseen, was certainly forming on his skin, a fine, crystalline residue of urea and other nitrogenous waste products attempting to escape through the sweat glands. The ammonia levels, spiking due to complete hepatic shutdown, the liver cells having succumbed to both radiation-induced apoptosis and ischemic necrosis, were fueling the most bizarre and terrifying hallucinations. The loss of urea cycle function meant that the ammonia was shunted directly into the systemic circulation, poisoning the remaining functional astrocytes. He saw colors that did not exist, deep violets and searing oranges that pulsed with the rhythm of his failing heart. These were not memories or dreams. They were pure, unadulterated sensory noise, generated by a poisoned brain struggling to maintain functional integrity. The auditory processing centers began to cross-talk with the visual cortex, causing the high-pitched whine to manifest as a shimmering heat haze that occluded his remaining peripheral vision, a phenomenon known as synesthesia, driven by toxicity. He tried to move, to roll onto his side, to escape the crushing weight of the earth, but the motor cortex was silent, the signals failing to reach the spinal cord. Profound flaccid paralysis had set in, the muscles refusing to obey, heavy and unresponsive, a final, concrete imprisonment within his own collapsing frame. The deep tendon reflexes were absent, confirming the extent of lower motor neuron involvement, likely secondary to peripheral neuropathy driven by the extreme toxemia and electrolyte depletion, manifesting as a generalized axonopathy, where the long motor axons were the first to fail under metabolic stress. The core body temperature was dropping precipitously, a profound hypothermia that slowed the remaining metabolic processes to a near halt, guaranteeing the failure of all enzyme-driven reactions necessary for cellular survival. He recognized this state, not intellectually, but instinctively. This was the end stage of acute radiation syndrome, the neurovascular phase having fully transitioned into the systemic organ failure that guaranteed death. The irradiated water had acted as a perfect delivery mechanism for the energy, distributing the damage evenly and lethally across every single vascular bed and replicating cell line, maximizing the systemic inflammatory response syndrome, SIRS. The cellular damage was not reversible. It was a fundamental shattering of cellular integrity, a programmed and forced degradation of every biological function, culminating in the irreversible failure of cellular homeostasis. The cold had reached his chest, a deep, penetrating freeze that seemed to lock his lungs in place, a sensation amplified by the lack of blood flow and the profound hypothermia. He registered the sensation of being lowered into cold water, though he was still lying on the dirt, a final profound dissociation from reality driven by the escalating encephalopathy. The gray was no longer just the absence of light. It was a weight, a heavy, velvet blanket pressing down on his consciousness, extinguishing the last flicker of self-awareness. The struggle ceased. The fight against the cold, against the crushing pressure, against the metallic taste, against the desperate need for air, simply stopped. There was only the sound of static, the high-frequency hiss of a television tuned to an empty channel, rapidly fading to silence as the auditory nerve ceased transmission. His breath became imperceptible, the long pause finally stretching out beyond the point of return. The respiratory drive fully suppressed by the CO2 narcosis and brainstem failure. The heart, weakened by toxins, lack of oxygen, and massive myocardial edema, gave a final, desperate shudder, a chaotic burst of ventricular electrical activity, and then stopped. The systemic failure was complete, the final, silent victory of the poison, leaving behind a body utterly saturated with the residue of its own failure. The gray was the color of silence, an absolute saturation that crushed the visual field, not with darkness, but with the total cessation of light interpretation. It was entropy made visible, the final flat line across the electroencephalogram of the universe. The pressure, once the weight of the Earth, transformed into the density of this gray, an infinite mass pressing against the optic nerve. Photoreceptors, damaged by hypoxia and free radical attack, had failed. The retinal pigment epithelium, deprived of oxygen and nutrient support, had undergone massive apoptosis, guaranteeing the permanent loss of signal transduction. The visual cortex, undergoing rapid ischemic necrosis, could no longer construct the memory of light, leaving behind a universal, featureless field, the dissolution of all subjective experience. A state beyond blindness where the mechanism of seeing had chemically dissolved. This uniform, featureless expanse represented the ultimate loss of spatial dimensionality, the brain's inability to map coordinate systems or recognize boundaries. The complex neural architecture responsible for generating depth perception had functionally liquefied, resulting in a single infinite plane of non-information. The metallic taste, the pervasive copper tongue of ruptured red blood cells and oxidized iron, lingered on the tongue. This phantom sensation, defying the absence of breath, echoed the massive internal hemorrhage, driven by volatile organic compounds and intracellular iron leakage from massive hemolysis. This acrid, ferrous flavor was the undeniable proof of systemic vascular collapse, the body tasting its own catastrophic failure. The sheer volume of free hemoglobin, unmetabolized due to immediate hepatic failure, saturated the remaining interstitial fluids. The liver, ravaged by radiation-induced centralobular necrosis, could no longer process the toxic load, allowing the iron to leach into every fluid compartment, including the oral mucosa, creating a visceral, chemical signature of internal decay that persisted even as consciousness waned. The profound flaccid paralysis remained absolute, a heavy, inert state defined only by gravity. The motor cortex, starved of oxygen, had gone completely silent, the final action potentials sputtering out across the damaged corticospinal tracts. Generalized axonopathy had progressed to complete denervation. The motor axons had undergone Wallerian degeneration, leaving the muscles disconnected from central command. The myelin sheaths, critical for rapid signal propagation, had been stripped and chemically compromised by the overwhelming inflammatory cascade, ensuring that even residual electrical activity was scattered and functionally useless. This was the total failure of biological communication, an irreversible imprisonment. Deep tendon reflexes were absent, the neurological pathways having chemically dissolved, the monosynaptic ARCS broken by profound cytotoxic edema. Proprioception, the body's internal sense of its own position, had vanished entirely, leaving the anatomical form as a weightless, meaningless sculpture to the dying brain. Involuntary systems, including the basal ganglia and cerebellar circuits, had ceased firing. The central pattern generators for automatic functions were silent, having succumbed to swift energy deprivation. The body was a zero-sum system, incapable of generating or receiving any command, a heavy, anatomical sculpture frozen in ultimate surrender. The spinal cord, now bathed in ischemic fluid, had lost its structural integrity, its gray matter becoming a non-functional mass. Core hypothermia deepened rapidly. With the heart stopped, remaining heat was lost through conduction to the cold, damp earth, accelerating algor mortis. The internal temperature gradient flattened swiftly, the body becoming a thermal extension of the environment, guaranteeing the cessation of all remaining enzyme-driven reactions. The cold was no longer discomfort. It was a physical reality, molecules slowing, chemical processes grinding to a halt. The cessation of electron transport meant the last vestiges of endogenous heat production were gone, transforming the organism into a purely thermodynamic object. The Q1O effect, the principle dictating that reaction rates decrease exponentially with temperature, had taken irreversible hold. Cellular water, no longer maintained at biological constants, began to behave purely according to physics. The brain's final perceptual mapping, the fleeting sensation of being submerged in cold water, was immediately superseded by the heavy inertia of non-feeling, a transition into thermal death. The high-frequency static that accompanied auditory nerve failure faded entirely, replaced by an absolute heavy silence. The auditory cortex ceased its interpretative function. This silence was not merely the absence of sound. It was the failure of the environment to register. The gray thickened, becoming the boundary condition of awareness. The reticular activating system, the ancient core of wakefulness, had collapsed, its intricate network of neurotransmitter release halted. Without its constant stimulation, the thalamus went dark, ensuring that no sensation, internal or external, could be synthesized into conscious thought. The brain's intrinsic rhythmicity, the alpha, beta, and even the terminal delta waves had ceased, leaving the cortex electrically flat. This was the end of the internal monologue, the cessation of the self-referential loop that defined existence. The last vestiges of neural synchronization dissolved, leaving only asynchronous noise that quickly decayed into the profound silent void. Microscopically, the systemic failure accelerated. The massive dose of radiation had ensured the vascular endothelium was compromised across the entire body. Capillary beds, particularly in the brain, lungs, gut, and kidneys, had leaked uncontrollably, leading to massive third spacing of fluid and profound hemorrhagic shock. The gut mucosa, highly sensitive to radiation, had sloughed entirely mucosal denudation, releasing a massive, uncontrolled flood of endogenous bacteria into the bloodstream, initiating a terminal systemic septic state that overwhelmed the already compromised immune system. The kidneys, having suffered acute tubular necrosis, ATN, from the shock and direct radiation damage, were functionally inert, incapable of filtering toxins or regulating fluid balance, accelerating the chemical toxicity of the circulating blood. Post-mortem, cellular integrity failed entirely. The blood-brain barrier, shattered by radiation, an overwhelming systemic inflammatory response syndrome, offered no resistance, resulting in severe cerebral edema that guaranteed the final compression and failure of the brainstem. The tissue was engorged, its structure smeared by hydrostatic pressure, forcing the cerebellar tonsils downward in a catastrophic herniation that erased the final, critical autonomic centers for respiration and cardiac rhythm. The lungs, saturated with fluid and blood due to failed pulmonary capillary integrity, were dense, non-functional masses, their alveoli destroyed by edema and radiation-induced pneumonitis, forming a heavy, sodden barrier to any potential gas exchange, a process now irrelevant. The brain itself was undergoing profound cytotoxic swelling. Mitochondria had been functionally destroyed by oxidative stress, leading to the complete failure of the sodium-potassium pumps. Without energy to maintain osmotic gradients, water rushed into the neurons, causing them to swell and rupture. This irreversible damage solidified the flaccid paralysis and the loss of consciousness. The cytoskeleton, the internal scaffolding of the cell, was fragmenting under the hydrostatic stress, leading to the dissolution of organized structure. The dendritic arborization, the complex structure of neural communication, was dissolving into shapeless blobs of dying protoplasm. The gray was the visual representation of this cellular suicide, a uniform field representing the loss of organized biological structure and the triumph of undifferentiated liquid mass. The massive influx of calcium ions, a key trigger for cellular death, locked the destructive pathways into place, guaranteeing autolytic destruction. The metallic taste intensified briefly with the initiation of autolysis. As cell membranes failed, lysosomal enzymes, the digestive machinery of the cell, were released into the cytoplasm. These powerful hydrolytic enzymes began to digest the cell components from within, releasing a flood of breakdown products, including putrescine, cadaverine, the signature polyamines of decay, and volatile sulfur compounds, contributing to an acrid, chemical odor already permeating the immediate environment. The body was actively consuming itself, accelerating its return to elemental components. The odor was the final, undeniable sensory marker of the transition from life to chemistry. The heart, having executed its final, chaotic ventricular shudder, was now utterly still, a dense, heavy organ saturated with interstitial fluid due to massive myocardial edema. Total lack of oxygen guaranteed widespread necrosis of the cardiac muscle tissue. The final electrical activity, the uncoordinated firing of dying pacemaker cells, collapsed, leaving the organ in terminal asystole. Massive coronary artery damage from the radiation ensured that even a remote possibility of resuscitation was chemically impossible. The tissue was structurally and electrically dead, its fibers disrupted by swelling and cellular rupture. In the skeletal muscles, the process leading to rigor mortis had begun. Without oxygen, the production of adenosine triphosphate, ATP, the molecule necessary for muscle relaxation, had ceased. The damaged sarcoplasmic reticulum could no longer sequester calcium ions, and the resulting high concentration of calcium triggered the irreversible binding of the actin and myosin filaments. Locked in their final cross-bridge formation, the muscles were suspended in biochemical rigidity, awaiting the eventual breakdown of the proteins themselves to release the tension. The body, momentarily rigidified by this chemical imprisonment, was held in a final heavy pose. The gray pressed harder, a palpable absence. It was the final, irreversible flattening of the world into a single, non-communicative dimension. The sensory input pathways were dead, the motor system useless. There was no pain, no cold, no fear, only the heavy, enveloping weight of non-existence, the complete victory of chemical stasis over biological dynamism. The residue of the irradiated water had completed its work, transforming the living, complex organism into a saturated, decaying mass. The last echo of consciousness, a fleeting, high-frequency resonance in the dying temporal lobe, flickered once, a purely abstract comprehension of absolute termination. and then dissolved into the overwhelming, silent field of pure, unadulterated chemical failure, leaving behind only the cold, inert structure of the body. The body's heavy, aqueous mass began its thermodynamic descent, but algor mortis was profoundly aberrant. Intense tissue saturation created a high thermal mass. The waterlogged musculature acted as a massive thermal reservoir, stalling core temperature momentarily, held by residual heat and the exothermic nature of the initial autolytic cascade. This thermal inertia prolonged the critical initial bacterial growth phase far beyond standard parameters, amplifying enzymatic reactions and ensuring the swift denaturation of key regulatory proteins. This guaranteed a rapid, simultaneous initiation of widespread cellular lysis across multiple organ systems. The delay in cooling provided a crucial window for opportunistic mesophilic bacteria to establish exponential growth before temperature suppression could exert any inhibitory effect. As the vascular system failed, livor mortis developed with unnatural speed and intensity. Compromised capillary integrity, structurally weakened by radiation-induced destruction of endothelial cell walls, allowed rapid and extensive extravasation of blood into dependent tissues. The resulting discoloration was an alarming, deep cherry red mixed with dark purple, a signature of massive oxygen depletion combined with radiation byproducts creating stable, highly colored hemoglobin derivatives such as methemoglobin and specific nitrosyl complexes. These chemical alterations were catalyzed by the influx of ionic free radicals. Lividity was fully fixed within an accelerated 2 hours. The profound tissue saturation ensured deeper penetration of blood into the dermal and subcutaneous layers, emphasizing the brutal efficiency of the circulatory collapse. The chemical alteration of the hemoglobin rendered the lividity resistant to forensic interpretation, fixing the body's position with irreversible finality. The chemically altered, highly viscous blood settled into dense, almost gelatinous pools within the compromised vasculature, further hindering any post-mortem redistribution. The engine of immediate post-mortem destruction shifted to the gastrointestinal tract, the epicenter of accelerated putrefaction. Radiation annihilated the protective mucosal lining, dissolving the epithelial barrier and granting the resident anaerobic microbiota, primarily Clostridium and Bacteroids, species immediate, unrestricted access to the necrotic tissue substrate. The rapid bacterial metabolism of proteins and carbohydrates yielded a massive and immediate enzyme release, manufacturing copious putrefactive gases, methane, hydrogen sulfide, carbon dioxide, and ammonia. The abdomen began to distend rapidly, taut and resonant like a drum, the visceral pressure building exponentially. Hydrogen sulfide, a primary byproduct of protein degradation, effused rapidly through the tissues, reacting instantly with iron in the hemoglobin to form sulfhemoglobin. This resulted in greenish-black marbling, tracing the superficial venous network across the torso and limbs. This process, normally taking days, was visibly established within 6 hours of death, a clear indicator of the intensity of the anaerobic activity. Internal pneumatic pressure continued to mount, forcing foul, dark, putrefactive fluids, known as purging out of the mouth and nose. This overwhelming pressure forcefully elevated the diaphragm and often led to the spontaneous rupture of larger abdominal vessels. The extreme mechanical stress led to localized subcutaneous emphysema that crackled audibly under palpation. The systemic dissemination of toxins and bacterial enzymes via the circulatory system was now complete, transforming the internal environment into a universal culture medium. Internally, the large, dense organs were liquefying under the combined assault of autolysis and bacterial enzymes. The liver, already massively swollen and congested, underwent fulminant colliquative necrosis. Its internal scaffolding failed completely, transforming the organ into a soft, mushy, bile-stained mass. The massive and uncontrolled release of hepatic enzymes created a highly reactive chemical soup, accelerating the degradation of surrounding peritoneal tissue. The kidneys, suffering total cortical necrosis from ionic shock and subsequent uremic toxicity, dissolved into sacks of necrotic pulp saturated with nitrogenous waste products. The pancreas, rich in digestive enzymes, underwent explosive autolysis, releasing its contents into the abdominal cavity, where they immediately began digesting adjacent fat and mesentery. The brain, high in lipid and water content, facilitated rapid enzymatic destruction, transforming the neural architecture into a soupy, grayish emulsion. While soft tissues dissolved, articular cartilage softened rapidly due to the hydrolysis of proteoglycans, and intervertebral discs delaminated, ensuring the body's posture would internally collapse and accelerating the commingling of putrefactive fluids. The skin, the body's last major structural barrier, failed profoundly. Radiation exposure destroyed the adhesive proteins between the epidermis and dermis. As putrefactive gases diffused outward, large, flaccid post-mortem bulla formed across the torso and limbs, filled with foul-smelling fluid. The slightest physical pressure caused the epidermis to shear away cleanly from the underlying dermis, resulting in extensive skin slippage. The body was literally shedding its outer layer with minimal mechanical force. This delamination was so extensive that entire gloves and socks of skin could be removed intact from the hands and feet. The integrity of the fascial planes, typically resilient, was breached by the combined enzymatic attack and hydrostatic pressure, allowing the putrefactive process to infiltrate deep muscle bundles, ensuring the destruction was systemic rather than superficial. The destruction of the skin barrier facilitated the rapid invasion of the environment by volatile decay products and the subsequent colonization by external insect fauna, though the immediate chemical toxicity of the surrounding tissues acted as a temporary deterrent. The odor emanating from the body intensified to a physically sickening level, a hyper-concentrated sensory assault. It was the complex, overwhelming bouquet of advanced putrefaction, dominated by the heavy, metallic tang of iron released from lysed red blood cells, the pungent, caustic sting of ammonia and volatile fatty acids, and the overwhelming, cloying sweetness of polyamines, putrescine, and cadaverine, the definitive markers of protein breakdown. Interspersed within this miasma was the sharp, distinctive scent of phosphine and highly toxic mercaptans, confirming accelerated anaerobic activity deep within the viscera. The air immediately surrounding the corpse achieved chemical saturation, a cloud of volatile decay products, dense enough to cause immediate physiological reactions in any observer-intense nausea, involuntary lacrimation, and a persistent metallic taste in the mouth. Rigor mortis, established hours earlier, was now at its peak intensity, holding the limbs and torso in a fixed, grotesque parody of life. The muscles were rock hard, fixed by the calcium surplus and the total absence of ATP required for relaxation. However, this rigidity was inherently temporary. The same hydrolytic enzymes that were rapidly destroying internal organs began the active digestion of the muscle proteins themselves. This secondary enzymatic softening, known as secondary flaccidity, swiftly resolved the rigor, transforming the inflexible corpse into a soft, malleable mass of dissolving tissue, accelerating physical collapse. Resolution was swiftest in the face and hands, before the larger muscle masses of the limbs and torso followed suit. This resolution was not a return to the pre-rigor state, but a progression to active degradation, marked by the release of highly reactive amino acids and peptides into the surrounding fluid matrix. The high water content guaranteed that decay would overwhelmingly favor liquefaction colliquative decomposition on a massive systemic scale. Connective tissues, including tendons and ligaments, were hydrolyzed rapidly by bacterial collageneses and elastases. The body was turning into a highly saturated sludge, a dense aqueous suspension of cellular debris, microbial biomass, and complex chemical waste products. Structural integrity failed completely. Waterlogged organs slumped under gravity, ensuring the total mixing of putrefactive fluids. The highly concentrated effluent saturated the substrate immediately beneath and surrounding the remains, seeding the immediate environment with resilient anaerobic spores and persistent chemical markers. Breakdown products, especially heavy metals sequestered by the body and the stable polyamines, persisted long after soft tissues dissolved, creating a lasting chemical signature in the soil matrix. This zone of saturation became a localized, highly toxic ecological niche. The body was no longer a system of cells, but a saturated exothermic bioreactor, ensuring that the return to elemental components was swift and total. The immediate ground turned into a fertile, dark-stained patch saturated with the viscous, highly reactive fluids of terminal decay, marking the final stage of structural dissolution and the complete assimilation of the remains into the terrestrial substrate. The chemical legacy of the irradiated tissue persisted, altering the local geochemistry and creating a persistent, identifiable footprint of the aberrant decomposition process. The finality of the dissolution was absolute. The remains were no longer a cohesive structure, but an aqueous slurry, a dense, dark-stained suspension where the boundary between organic tissue and saturated earth had dissolved entirely. Liquefaction, accelerated by the internal heat generated by intense microbial metabolism, had reduced the torso to a reservoir of highly reactive fluid. This accelerated thermal activity, driven by exothermic anaerobic processes, optimized the kinetics for hydrolytic reactions far beyond typical ambient rates. The skin, compromised by blistering and relentless internal gas pressure, primarily methane, carbon dioxide, and hydrogen sulfide, had ruptured entirely, releasing the viscous, dark reddish-brown effluent into the surrounding substrate. This expulsion concluded the macroscopic phase of decay. Hydrolytic enzymes and bacterial collagenases had completed their work on the refractory connective tissue, systematically dismantling the triple helix of collagen and resilient elastin fibers. Cartilage dissolved rapidly into soluble mucopolysaccharides, further increasing the viscosity and chemical reactivity of the fluid. Simultaneously, the bone matrix began the slow, inevitable process of demineralization. This process was critically accelerated by the high concentration of organic acids, particularly lactic and formic acids, generated during anaerobic metabolism. These acids chelated and solubilized the crystalline hydroxyapatite, releasing calcium and phosphate ions that reacted immediately with amines and organic acids in the surrounding sludge. These components often precipitated locally as complex organic salts or insoluble secondary mineral phases, such as struvite, within the dense sediment. Skeletal articulation failed completely. The bones, stripped clean of periosteum and ligamentous attachments, settled haphazardly into the dense sediment, becoming inert mineral components within the toxic matrix, marking the transition from biological structure to geological inclusion. Decomposition had crossed the threshold from putrefaction into total chemical assimilation. The high water content of the irradiated tissue, severely compromised by initial radiation necrosis and subsequent cellular failure, had driven the process relentlessly toward colliquative necrosis. This specific form of tissue death, characterized by rapid dissolution, was exacerbated by the initial damage that released massive quantities of intracellular lytic enzymes, lysosomal hydrolysis, simultaneously initiating self-digestion, autolysis, before the bacterial invasion fully took hold. This left behind only the most resilient structures and the immutable chemical burden the body had sequestered from the poisoned source water. The deceased had functioned as a highly efficient biological filter, concentrating the most dangerous contaminants, heavy metals, and radioisotopes into the soft tissues before their rapid demise. These elements, including lead, cadmium, arsenic, and mercury, were now leaching out, complexed tightly with the stable polyamines, putrescine, and cadaverine. These diamines resisted immediate microbial breakdown due to their strong basicity and inhibitory effects on many common soil bacteria. The complexes formed highly stable, persistent markers in the soil matrix, where the strong chelating properties of the polyamines locked the heavy metals into a chemical form that minimized immediate mobility but perpetuated the localized toxicity. The unique chemical fingerprint of the remains was thus defined by these metallopolyamine complexes, providing a signature resistant to environmental remediation. The chemical legacy was twofold: the bulk organic decay products and the persistent radioisotope plume. While the organic sludge would eventually mineralize through the slow action of specialized anaerobic consortia, the dominant gamma and beta emitters, specifically cesium-137 and strontium-90, along with traces of concentrated transuranics like plutonium and americium isotopes, were migrating outward. The biological timescale, measured in days from initial exposure to structural collapse, had abruptly given way to the geological timescale of radioactive decay, where the effective half-lives of the contaminants spanned decades or even millennia. The immediate environment was transitioning from a localized biological hazard zone to a persistent radiological scar. Cesium-137, a highly mobile cation, began to interact strongly with the interlayer spaces of specific clay minerals, particularly illite and vermiculite, in the soil, leading to fixation and retardation of its migration, although a soluble fraction continued to move with the water flow. Strontium-90, chemically similar to calcium, co-precipitated with the phosphate and carbonate salts released during bone dissolution, creating localized hotspots of high beta activity within the bone fragments and surrounding sediment. The high concentration of sulfur-containing organic compounds, including a complex mixture of mercaptans, thiols, thioethers, and dimethyl disulfide, continued to off-gas from the saturated earth, perpetuating the metallic, sweet stench that defined the immediate vicinity. This chemical persistence served as a sensory proxy for the unseen radiological contamination, a volatile warning signal of the profound chemical alteration below the surface. The rate of volatile organic sulfur compound, VOSC, release was directly correlated with the intense reduction potential created by the anaerobic environment. The viscous effluent did not simply soak into the ground. Its high density and concentrated dissolved solids dictated a specific slow flow pattern. The density of the effluent, significantly higher than ambient groundwater, drove a gravitational density flow, allowing the plume to sink slowly and saturate the soil pores below the water table. This created a localized contamination plume that moved primarily through capillary action and density flows rather than rapid diffusion. This zone, rich in high molecular weight organic acids and reactive nitrogen and sulfhydryl compounds, became an extreme ecological niche. The pH dropped precipitously in the immediate vicinity due to the accumulation of carboxylic acids, creating a chemically hostile environment that sterilized the local aerobic soil microbiome. Only highly specialized, resilient anaerobic bacteria, including sulfate reducers and methanogens, thrived in the low redox potential environment, further altering the geochemistry by producing reduced iron and sulfur species. The dark, greasy staining on the earth resisted natural degradation. This persistent discoloration was the visual manifestation of the complexation of highly stable humic acids and fulvic acids, end products of complex organic matter breakdown with the heavy metal salts and long-chain hydrocarbon residues released during cellular lysis and fat saponification. The resulting organometallic complexes were chemically robust, imparting a lasting hydrophobic quality to the stained earth that resisted leaching and dispersion. The process of final dissolution was notably exothermic, driven by the intense metabolic activity of microbial consortia, particularly members of the genera Clostridium and Bacteroids. This localized heat ensured the maximum possible dissolution rate accelerating the breakdown of residual fatty acids into volatile, short-chain carboxylic acids, and further increasing the saturation of the air with decay products. The remnants of the body were now fully integrated into the terrestrial substrate, a dense, highly reactive layer distinguishable from the surrounding uncontaminated Earth by its texture, odor, and extreme chemical composition. The refractory components, the heavy metals, and the radioactive isotopes were now binding strongly to the clay, minerals, and organic matter within the soil profile, creating a fixed, identifiable footprint. The radiocesium became chemically fixed within the lattice structure of expanding clay minerals, making its subsequent release extremely slow. The heavy metals were bound through cation exchange mechanisms and complexation with the abundant organic ligands. Even after the soft tissues fully mineralized and the volatile odors dissipated, the chemical alteration of the clay and organic layers would remain, a complex of metallic salts and long-lived radionuclides. This indelible mark would require sophisticated analytical techniques, including high-resolution inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry, ICP-MS, for elemental analysis, and gamma spectroscopy coupled with sequential extraction protocols to determine the chemical mobility and fixation state of the radionuclides decades later. The ingestion of the irradiated water had culminated not merely in death, but in the creation of a localized, permanent toxic monument, an indelible scar upon the landscape marking the spot where the rapid biological processes of life and death yielded to the immutable persistence of chemical and radiological decay. The final state was one of total assimilation, where the human form had been sacrificed to create a lasting, dangerous geological anomaly.